There are certain fighters who are being hyped up as future superstars, but they failed to live up to the hype. So here is 10 fighters who look like future stars but failed. Number 10. Uriah Hall came into the UFC in 2013 after putting together some very violent finishes on The Ultimate Fighter, where many people were saying that he was the next big thing in the UFC. There was a lot of hype surrounding Uriah Hall as a potential fighter who would destroy some of the best middleweights in the UFC. His aggressive fighting style helped him make it to the finals, where he would lose to Kelvin Gastelum by a split decision. Whilst on the UFC roster, he has trouble against elite competition, which has prevented him moving forward. He has had many ups and downs where he hasn't been able to start a successful run. He's a very talented fighter who has the ability to make it a bad night for any fighter, which was seen when he finished Gegard Mousasi by TKO at UFC Fight 75. Number 9. Eirick Silva came into the UFC in 2011 as one of the biggest welterweight prospects in Brazil. He was known for his exciting fighting style and was expected to do big things in the UFC. In his first few fights in the UFC, we saw him just run through fighters very quickly, where the hype surrounding him looked very real, but it didn't last long. As he started moving up the welterweight ladder, the tough competition gave him a lot of difficulty, where he slowly started to decline, where he never seemed like the same fighter he used to be. He has been through many rough patches in the UFC, where he hasn't been able to start a successful run. Number 8. Hatsue Aoki came into the UFC in 2011 as one of the biggest featherweight prospects out of Japan. He was a well-known name in many organizations across Japan and was expected to be very successful in the UFC. He made his UFC debut, defeating George Roop at UFC 137 and defeated Bart Palazewski at UFC 144. After 2 great wins, the UFC had offered him a title shot against then UFC featherweight champion Jose Aldo, but Hatsue Aoki declined, saying that he needed more fight experience in the UFC. He would next go 1-5 in the UFC, where he would lose his last fight to Dan Hooker at UFC Fight 65 and was released from the promotion. Number 7. Houston Alexander came into the UFC in 2007 as a light heavyweight prospect who had a lot of finishes on his MMA record. He made his UFC debut, destroying Keith Jardine in just 48 seconds at UFC 71 and finished Alessio Sakara in just 1 minute at UFC 75. With 2 violent finishes in the UFC, he started to look like an unstoppable force, where it seemed like he would become a future world champion, but that wasn't the case. He would lose his next 4 fights in a row, where his last fight was against the late Kimbo Slice, where he would lose by a unanimous decision at the Ultimate Fighter 10 finale, resulting in his release from the promotion. Number 6. Jessica Ai came into the UFC in 2013 as one of the biggest bantamweight prospects who was doing well in the regional scene and was expected to do the same in the UFC. Since her time with the promotion, she has only 1 victory over Leslie Smith and has lost 5 fights. The top competition in the bantamweight division has made it hard for her to pick up a win, where she is on the brink of being cut from the UFC roster. She has recently moved down to the flyweight division, where she is looking to start fresh and start a run in the weight class. Number 5. Hector Lombard came into the UFC as the former Bellator middleweight champion who was just wrecking fighters with his crazy power. He was known for his aggressive fighting style and his one-punch knockout power. Once signing with the UFC in 2012, many thought that he would break his way to the top and possibly dethrone then UFC middleweight champion Anderson Silva, but that wasn't the case. He has only won 3 fights and has lost 6 fights in the promotion. He has been forced to move up and down in weight divisions, where he has struggled against world-class competition. Number 4. Brandon Vera came into the UFC in 2005 as a young prospect who had a lot of talent. He was quickly able to put together 4 impressive finishes in the UFC, including a victory over former UFC heavyweight champion Frank Mir. He started to look like the next big thing and was getting a lot of praise for his performances. He had mentioned in interviews that his goal was to hold both the UFC heavyweight and light heavyweight titles and defend the titles in both weight classes, but that never happened. He immediately declined, where he had a pattern of wins and losses on his record, where he never seemed like the same fighter he once was. His last fight in the UFC was against Ben Rothwell at UFC 164, where he would lose the fight by TKO and was released from the promotion. Number 3. Mirko Cro Cop came into the UFC as the 2006 Pride World Openweight Grand Prix champion who was just flattening fighters in the organization. He was known for his vicious head kick knockouts, which had sent shockwaves across the MMA world. Once signing with the UFC in 2007, there was high expectations from him, where many were saying that he would conquer the UFC heavyweight division, but that wasn't the case. He had some success in the UFC, but would struggle against elite competition. He had put together a UFC record of 8 wins and 6 losses, where he left the UFC after defeating Gabriel Gonzaga at UFC Fight 64. Number 2. Takanori Gomi came into the UFC in 2010 as one of the biggest stars in Pride, who was putting on great performances against the best fighters in the organization. He was known for his aggressive fighting style and his knockout power. Once signing with the UFC in 2010, there was a lot of hype surrounding him, where many people were saying that he would take the UFC by storm, but that didn't happen. In his time in the UFC, he has only won 4 fights and has lost 9 fights in the promotion. He has shown a glimpse of his old self, but hasn't been able to start a successful run. Number 1. Kid Yamamoto came into the UFC in 2011 as one of the most recognizable names in Japan, who had fought all across the country, putting on great performances. He was known for his high finishing rate and was being hyped up as the next big UFC superstar. Since coming to the UFC, he hasn't been able to win a fight, where he's currently on a 3-fight losing streak and has one fight which is a no contest. He has struggled with elite fighters in the UFC, where he hasn't been able to pick up a win since joining the promotion.